I know a young woman who's homeless with her child. She spent 2 weeks of temporary accommodation in Vincentian House in Surrey Hills, run by the St Vincent de Paul Society. While she was there, she knew that there were a number of units available for people. But as a matter of habit, every morning, an organisation who called Vincentian House to place people in accommodation, homeless people in accommodation, were told by the Vincentian House that they were full. They blatantly lied. She met women in Vincentian House who'd had their children taken away from them because they were homeless. One woman's child was murdered in foster care. This young woman that I know was told after her 2 weeks temporary accommodation was expired, she was told by docs that they were going to take her child from her. So, being a fairly intelligent, she decided that she would go to the MP, Alex Greenwich. He intervened on her behalf, and they rang the housing department and demanded an interview with them over this young woman's situation. And they after months of trying to get accommodation through Department of Housing, they said, because of his intervention, they said, no, we've organised something for this person. So she's now in a place in Dulwich Hill, which is run by the Salvation Army. There's a huge unit there which is meant for single women, which is empty all the time, except for one woman. So she knows at the start the caseworkers are abusive. The caseworkers there are stealing the food vouchers and using them for themselves. So a lot of people don't have the skills to be able to, or knowledge to be able to access their local MP to intervene on their behalf. Now, as you know, a lot of the women's refuges, specialist women's refuges, have been closed down and tendered out to and turned into generic refuges. So that's a disincentive for women fleeing domestic violence to leave home under the going home, staying home plan. It seems like a deliberate disincentive to women to leave home. So obviously more women are going to die, or their children are going to die or be injured due to domestic violence. So what do you think about the fact that considering this element of corruption in these refuges by these religious organisations, what do you think of the fact that the government has been basically privatised these refuges? Because these places are funded by the government, but they are managed by religious organisations. So the question is, what do you think about that?
There's a couple of things I could say. There are good organisations and there are bad organisations. And across the service delivery system, I've worked in community services for a number of years now, and there are always bad cases. There is actually, and I don't think it's well enough understood, but there are processes to deal with that through the New South Wales Ombudsman. And so but these complaint mechanisms are not well understood, and for particularly vulnerable people who are dependent on getting access to a service, they're not readily going to take it up, which is why there are a range of organisations, again not well funded, who would do that. So I certainly understand the point you're making, and there are supposed to be processes in place. It is I think organisations like Homelessness New South Wales and Shelter New South Wales, we would argue that it is certainly privatisation, but these are services that were never run by government. Government have funded them for many years. They've never been run. They've been run by a range of different organisations over many years. The latest round of tendering has caused enormous angst across the sector, regardless of whether people thought the outcomes for particular organisations were good, bad or indifferent. It's caused enormous angst from the sector, and Shelter, who at the moment are doing a range of consultations with the sector about housing issues generally, not just specifically these reforms, we are noticing that it comes up a lot, and so that's obviously something that we need to take on board and raise with government as well. I'm not going to comment on particular cases because I don't really know it. And many of these organisations are also our members. And so obviously, because we're big bodies, we're an organisation that has other organisations as members. And obviously, before we make any comment about our members, we'd obviously like to get their side of particular stories as well. But suffice to say that there does need to be good and robust transparency processes so that when bad things happen, and they do, they can at least be dealt with fairly and properly. And we recognise that for vulnerable people, that's hard.
One of the things that we've been working with our members with and across the board and trying to get the government slowly coming on board is for better consumer participation, because services that have got consumers on their boards, that have consumers helping to build the policies and the procedures, are better run than organisations that don't. Generally, across the road in community services, across the road, whether it's disability, homelessness, whatever. If you actually listen to your consumers, people who use your service, you run a better business. Whether you're Coca-Cola or a homeless service, you actually do a better service if you listen to your consumers. And so we've been working on that. There will be, under the new, in the next year or so, there's now more work happening so that as part of the procedure for services to be accredited, they'll have to have better consumer participation. So that's something we've been working towards, and we are getting there.
My name is Dennis Goldie. I'm with a group around here called Hands Off Leave, which is an advocacy group for public housing, and along with some other groups we're launching this action for public housing. I hope you can give me some indulgence here. If I could just give you a brief history of housing in the last 5 to 10 years in Glebe. Directly across the road here is Harold Park, where they put 1,200 apartments on a spare piece of land. Now that land went to a corporation called Mirvac. Mirvac owns Broadway and a squillion of other things. They are set to score over $1 billion in profit. Now, in that property, the law says that they have to put 4% of the land aside for affordable housing, which they did. And they gave that land to the council, who then sold it. They sold it for $40 million to City West. And when Clover Moore was asked, why did you sell it? Because we need so much public housing. She said, because so that this is the richest council in New South Wales. She said, so that I could stand up for the ratepayers. And she sold it to a not-for-profit organisation called City West, who are now building about 100 affordable properties, which are affordable in their sense is 20% below market rent, so which would be about $500 a week. If you move a little bit further over is Bayes Precinct with the near White Bay. Bayes Precinct will have 16,000 new residents in it. 16,000, but it's still only going to be 4% is going to be housing. And the people who get that, the corporations who get that, are set to make a squillion. Now, this is a wonderful document, very worthy and so on, yet we have here in the first sentence, in the first reform number 1, almost the last sentence, the funds should be deployed in tandem with strategies to attract private investment into the affordable housing sector, with the precise means for this to be informed by the current policy process managed by the Affordable Housing Working Group. Now that, to me, is fantasy. Fantasy. How would you expect a corporation like Mirvac to involve itself in affordable housing when they are getting 20-25% profit? When if they go into affordable, they'll get down to 5 or 6% profit. If you go a little bit further over here, at the end of Bay Street near Broadway Shopping Centre. They pushed 300 housing tenants out, and they're building a new house as we speak before the Central Sydney Planning Authority Committee tonight. They are going to approve a social housing unit for 150 people. They had 300 there, they've now got 150. They're going to be bed sits, basically, with no parking, no facilities. And if you had X-ray vision, you could stand at that site and look across Wentworth Park through the Greyhound racing track and to the aqueducts there. There are 60 people living rough, and the government sold that land off. Sold it off to a Singaporean corporation. And the plan was for Cowper Street, which they devised in 2009, to make it 50-50. Now, when they went to Millers Point shortly after, they made it 100%. Get rid of everybody out of there, 100%. When they've gone to Waterloo, they've come up with a new plan, 70-30. They're kicking everybody out, and when the people come back, only 30% of them will be social housing people or public housing people. So, but there's nothing here about stopping the destruction of public housing in this document. So the two questions are, the involvement of private enterprise is a fantasy. How can you justify that? It's unrealistic. And Alison, you said in your talk, the government can't afford these things. The government can afford prisons. The government can afford 1.6 billion for a new stadiums. The government gave $500 million subsidy to New South Wales clubs.
What was your second question?
Second question is, there's nothing here about the destruction of public housing and preventing that. What's going on?
The reason there's nothing there about public housing is it's a state government matter, and the Commonwealth actually doesn't run public housing. The whole part of Reform 1, though, was to get more investment to the states for exactly that. It's the reality, and I think it's fair to say that the partners who came together on Vote Home, the reason we are seeking to leverage off, and I hate using those terms, but that's exactly what we're trying to do, private sector involvement, is that the 15 billion we're seeking from the Commonwealth isn't actually enough to meet the need, and unless we get some form of contribution through things like inclusionary zoning, which is the concept of having a certain proportion of development set aside, 4% is 4% more than in many places around here, but I think most people who are in favour of inclusionary zoning are saying it should be at least 10%, but those are the things. So that is why we've looked to see what we can have there. The reality is, and I agree with you, the state government in particular can afford all sorts of things. Land and Housing Corporation that owns these, however, can't. And they're an off-budget entity, and that's been part of the problem we have. We need to have commitments from government at both Commonwealth and state level, recognising, as I said before, up until about the late 70s, the Commonwealth was in fact the major contributor of those funds. Yes, it was the state government that actually used the funds and built the properties, usually by the private sector, but that was the case. The Commonwealth, since the late 70s, early 80s, has eased off quite substantially the amount of money they put forward.
Yeah, we've advocated for some time. We've been lobbying the major parties about bringing the very fast train, particularly the route that they've had for a long time in mind, until they sold off the airport to Turnbull and Randbank and Macquarie Bank, from Sydney to Canberra through Goulburn, and that would mean, they say, they put an airport at Goulburn. In any case, people could commute from Goulburn, right? And if they took it up to also to Gosford, but a lot of people do commute. So both Shorten and Turnbull have mentioned the thing before the election. but we've been unable to get any response from them on this idea. It's likely they could actually build this thing before Badgerys Creek is even planned or anything, right? You'd think there would be some ideas where to put the roof. And another point is, Abbott used to go on about they can't find people to pick grapes and stuff, right? But the point is that if you're unemployed, there's a thing that was brought in by the Labor Party that we call the Dole, hippie Dole law. That is to say, if you say move to Katoomba or to Goulburn or up north from Sydney, they cut you off the dole for 6 months because they say that you're moving to a place of less employment prospects, right? And the Libs, what do? They increase the penalty to a year or something like that. So, there you have it. The farmers are having big trouble getting people in to pick their fruit. There was a story on Four Corners about farmers ripping off backpackers, and now they're having even more trouble getting people from overseas to come and do this stuff. But of course, if you go and try to do it yourself, well, you'll have to live out there. You won't be able to get back in the rental market here, right, if you're travelling around doing that stuff. You can't keep paying rent if you're going out looking for picking fruit. So that's just a very practical idea, right? The jobless really can't afford to live in Sydney, except in shocking conditions these days, right? And I can just, someone wants to talk here too, but Tanya Plibersek, I might just remind people, when they had a social housing fund during the GFC, that money was taken out of that because the school halls program became a lot of people on the school halls in their schools, right? And so she was robbing that particular fund of built social housing, right? The other thing that she seemed to be involved in as housing minister was the affordable housing scheme that the government had for 80% of your rental income. This affordable housing, there's a scandal about this. I think only Queensland did something about it. Was most of this money was going for foreign students to live in flats. It wasn't really even going to nurses and cops, those sort of people. So there's been rorts all over the place.
Have you got a specific question for our guests?
Well, what particular policies do the people on the panel have that are really practical, apart from saying we'll spend more on social housing? Would they back the idea we do need to decentralise Sydney? There's no two ways about it.
I've got to say I'm a fan of the very fast train, have been for a long time. I leave to others the question of the best route and where to site it. But there is no doubt, one of the dilemmas we have, of course, is that any major transport infrastructure actually causes house prices to increase in the vicinity because of the convenience and the like. An idea that Shelter has certainly done work on, not me, I'm not an expert in this field, but Shelter has done work on, is the notion of value capture. So where government makes a decision to rezone land, for example, that allows the owner of that land to make a windfall gain, or where they provide infrastructure like a very fast train or a new bus route, or hospitals and schools are the other ones, that causes an increase in the value of the land around those areas. There should be some way of capturing back to government to spend, we would argue, on social and affordable housing for low-income folk. There should be some way of capturing that back. It's done in other places in the world in very different ways. For those of you that might have heard of the Conversation electronic bulletin that comes out today, they actually had an explainer on value capture, and I would highly recommend if people are interested in that. So I think ideas about having people in a mix of income groups close to jobs, close to transport, close to hospitals and schools. Yeah, absolutely fantastic. And the very fast train is certainly part of that mix. I'm just raising the issue about, though, we need to make sure it's done in a way so that, again, it just doesn't become for rich folk to benefit.
And I mean, because just to go on from Alison, I mean, a number of years ago, Wellington, which is just out near Dubbo, was a very depressed economy, very depressed little town. For 2 years running, it had the fastest percentage land value increase in New South Wales when they put a jail out there. So this is the point Alison's making. When you actually go and make decisions about putting facilities in places, the land goes up automatically. And so it's the value capture. Somehow we've got to capture that value. We had a recent meeting and the Minister, I'll verbal the Minister, Brad Hazzard, he actually likes the idea of value capture, he understands it, and he can see some worth in it. So for us, they're great comments for him to be making.
The organisations that do positive things for homelessness and contribute money, would it be positive and helpful to acknowledge these organisations and make more media about where the money is coming from, if it's not coming from the government, or if the government can't supply enough money, therefore promote the organisations and charities that are contributing to the issue, so that more money comes in from elsewhere rather than the government, without making it formal.
Yes, every homeless service in New South Wales, for the money that they get from the government, spends that plus. Every service, the faith-based large state ones, the small ones in little country towns, they all do it. We had a service down in Young a few years ago who actually they lost their building, was taken, the people who own the building said, we need that back. So they were actually able to go to the community and fundraise in the town of Young to buy a new building for their service. So everybody does that in their own way. It's one of those things that they're all great at doing. And we keep telling them they've got to do more of that, because that's how they'll survive in the real world out there. And it's a real world. Well, they do publicise it. I mean, up in Tamworth Family Services in the last few years, they're getting about a media story every other week now in some form of media up there. So they've done some really good work to actually work with the Country Music Festival up there, to actually have a part of that is now dedicated on homelessness and the work that the family services do up there on a whole range of issues. So they do it across the board. Sometimes you don't hear about it, sometimes you do. Getting media is a... If I understood how to get the media's attention all the time, I'd be a very rich man.
Thanks very much to the panel. Basically, Morrison talks about the fact that the Labor Party is trying to launch a class war in Australia. Well, really what we're talking about in terms of housing in this country is a product of that. So essentially, to me, the homelessness crisis is just a product of the total unaffordability of housing in Australia. Because if you're at the bottom end of it, even at the middle end, you can't afford housing. Ordinary working class people can't afford to buy a house. And it just flows on down. And I've seen, people would have seen on TV recently, interviews with some of the young couples that go out there and try and buy a house. It's ridiculous. The price of housing in Sydney is ridiculous. And this flows right down. No one can afford a house. So what we've actually got to do is sort of tackle this whole neoliberal agenda, selling off. I mean, I am very well acquainted with the situation facing the people in Millers Point. In Millers Point, you've got wonderful housing, probably some people say, one of the best public housing settlements that in Australia and even internationally. The only reason the government is selling it off is to make money in order to build West Connex. they're not using the money from selling off the housing in Millers Point to build more public housing. The whole public housing stock is being run down. So, to me, you know, what I suppose my question is really, it's almost impossible to separate the housing question and the homelessness question from an actual class war against these governments that don't see any value in public housing, don't see any value in social housing. We're going to have to take them on. Even it relates to the question of the basic freeze on wages. People can't afford housing in general, and we've got to actually link up the problem of homelessness with the problem of housing in general, and how are we going to sort of take on this total neoliberal offensive? I know that's a big question, but anyway.
I've got a little graph in my office, and on that graph it shows me that from about 1965 to about 1985, the average cost of a house in Australia was 3 times, the mean price of a house in Australia was 3 times the annual salary. It is now 12 times. So we have a major problem, the gap between house prices and people's incomes. That is the problem. Which is why we support a range of measures, because you're right, if we can build more public housing, and we do need that, but we actually need to address this. As groups or strata of society can't afford where they're living, they push pressure down, and they put pressure down, and they come down, and then in the end, as the bottom gets squeezed out. So that's why we do need levels of affordable housing. We do need a whole range of policy, procedures from government to ensure actually have those out there. Because otherwise, you're right, the pressure comes down to the bottom, and we end up with people living on the street.
John Hallam, United Nations weapons lobbyist and Department of Housing resident. I've been resident in the Department of Housing in Lilyfield for nearly 30 years, and I've observed a change over the years. When my beloved and I first moved in after a 5-year wait, I understand it's 10 years now, it was mostly sort of rather genteel age pension people. We now seem to be surrounded entirely by people who are stark, staring bonkers. There's a woman upstairs, at least I'm not sure if it's one woman or 6, and she regularly gets taken away by the crisis team, etc. And this seems to be a trend which is setting in for, I don't know, for forever. I'm wondering if you have any comment on the changing demographic of Department of Housing clientele, and any sort of crystal ball gazing as to what the future is likely to hold for those of us who continue to live in public housing.
This is something that's definitely an issue. It's raised an awful lot, and certainly in the short time I've been at Shelter as a policy officer, one of the roles I've had is to go out and talk to a range of people about their experiences of housing generally. And when you talk to public housing tenants, this is the issue that comes up the most. We have public housing estates where, because of people on the priority list, there are very mixed communities now, and the needs and the complexity of those needs have increased greatly.
Mixed would be wonderful.
Mixed would be wonderful.
It's getting to be a psychopathological monotone.
And this is one of the big issues we have, because public housing has become housing of last resort, as in some ways as it should be, but without the other parts of the question, which is the support that those people need to be able to live without all the aggravations that living next to them might bring. And it is doable, because it is being done in some places, but certainly, again, this is another one where the public housing system doesn't talk so well to mental health services and the health system in particular. And it's an increasing issue, which unfortunately I suspect some in government are using as a reason to justify their move to having people who qualify for public and social housing to actually get subsidised to be in the private rental market rather than to have concentrations of public and social housing estates, if you like. And I think this is something that Shelter has certainly been doing some work on, and I know a lot of the tenants groups are doing work on, because we don't, while there are definitely issues there that need to be addressed, there is no doubt about that, we also don't want a system that would in fact be worse, which is the private rental market. And so that's my crystal ball gazing, is how do we actually manage that? That's a difficult conversation, doesn't mean it's one we shouldn't have.
The other graph I have in my room tells me that in the last 20 years or so, we've lost 20,000 public housing dwellings across New South Wales, while the population of New South Wales has increased by 1 million people. Now, I'm not the world's greatest demographer, but I know there's a problem there. So that's part of it. And that, leading on to what Alison was saying, is that's part of the problem that Land and Housing Corporation have. The fact that when I grew up in my suburb, I had people in public, they were in public housing, but they were working. And so people, you know, and I'll use, the figures are not accurate, so excuse that my maths isn't great sometimes. But if you had a person who's working in public housing and paying 25% and they're earning $40,000, the government, as the landlord's, getting $10,000, which gives them enough to upkeep the property and a bit more. However, as we've squeezed the access into public housing to people with more and more complex needs, the only people going in there now basically are with complex needs, who are then on a pension, and nothing wrong with that, that's reality of life. And say it's $10,000 a year they're earning, so 25% of that is $2,500, which doesn't pay for the upkeep of the property, which means Land and Housing Corporation, the way that they have been financing their operations is by flogging off properties. Because if I can't pay the upkeep on my property, I have to flog off properties to keep properties rolling over. Yeah. So there's a real problem out there. So that's the problem. I don't, crystal ball gazing is not my speciality. I'm good at knowing problems.